Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. This helps promote videos like this and motivates us to make more. But what if one city could change the entire world? Imagine a place where myth blends with history, where the will and ambition of individuals shape the fate of continents. That city is Rome. It didn't just exist, it burned, it fought wars, it created laws, cultures, and entire states. Its influence is still felt today in language, architecture, law, and even in the very idea of civilization. This is a story not only about victories and defeats, but also about human nature in all its greatness and weakness. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it didn't fall in a single night. This is the story of the rise and fall of the greatest empire in human history. Deep in the mists of antiquity, among the hills of Latium, one of the most captivating legends in human history is born, the story of the founding of Rome. Before Rome became a city-state, then a republic, and later an empire, it was just a dream shrouded in myths and legends passed down by word of mouth. According to the most famous version, it all began with Romulus and Remus, twin brothers who were raised by a she-wolf. Their story symbolizes the brutality, strength, betrayal, and sacrifice that would become part of the character of the future empire. Romulus, after killing his brother, founded a city named after himself, Rome. Even in the very first scene, we see that power and violence are an inseparable part of Rome's destiny. But behind the myths, there is also reality. Archaeological excavations confirm that settlements really did exist on the site of the future Rome long before the official founding date, 753 BC. The 7 hills on which Rome spread out were convenient for defense, and the Tiber River provided fresh water and a route to the coast. The region of Latium was inhabited by various tribes: the Tyrrhenians, the Sabines, and the Etruscans. These cultures were constantly interacting, trading, sometimes fighting, and sometimes mixing with each other. It was in this cultural melting pot that the unique Roman identity was born, flexible, practical, and eager to borrow from others. Originally, Rome was a small settlement of shepherds and farmers. Its political structure was extremely primitive: chiefs, elders, and clan councils. However, even then, a distinctive feature of Rome began to take shape: its willingness to change, to adopt the best from others, and to constantly expand its influence. The Etruscans played a special role in the early development of the city, a mysterious people from the north with a high level of culture and technology. It was the Etruscans who taught the Romans how to build arches, sewers, paved roads, and fortified walls. According to some sources, even the first kings of Rome were Etruscans. Among the early kings, Numa Pompilius stands out, the second king, known as a peacemaker and lawgiver. During his reign, the foundations of Roman religion were established, along with priestly institutions, rituals, and festivals. Rome began to see itself not just as a settlement, but as something greater, a community united by shared ceremonies and laws. However, kings did not rule forever. The last king, Tarquin the Proud, went down in history as a tyrant. His expulsion in 509 BC marked the beginning of an entirely new era, the Roman Republic. But we'll talk about that in the next chapter. For now, Rome was still young, and its character was only just taking shape. It was already distinguished by its toughness, pragmatism, and its drive for control and order. It already had a spirit of discipline, perseverance, and belief in its own destiny. This spirit would become the driving force of the empire that would change the course of history. But cities aren't built on myths alone. Behind the legends were harsh realities, painstaking labor, the struggle for survival, and slow but determined progress. The first inhabitants of Rome, farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen, did not dream of an empire. They dreamed of tomorrow of feeding their families, protecting their livestock from thieves, making trade agreements with their neighbors, or, if necessary, defeating them in battle. It was precisely in this constant tension between threat and hope, between humble daily life and great ambitions, that the unique Roman mentality was formed. She did not tolerate excesses, but extolled work. She did not approve of weakness, but valued loyalty. This was a culture of endurance, willpower, and devotion. Three concepts became the key Roman virtues: pietas, gravitas, and virtus. Pietas is the sense of duty toward family, the gods, and the homeland. Gravitas means seriousness, dignity, and the weight of one's word. Virtus, valor, courage, and active participation in the life of the state. These ideals were not just abstract concepts. They permeated everyday life, from how you managed your household to how you fought in the army. All of this was a reflection of your Roman identity. Rome's political system during the era of the kings was extremely centralized. The king, or rex, held absolute power, but he was required to observe religious rituals and act in the interests of the people. Tradition counts 7 kings, each of whom, according to legend, left their mark on the development of the city. Romulus, the founder of the city and its first institutions. Numa Pompilius, the creator of the priestly system, the calendar, and sacrificial rites. Tullus Hostilius, the conqueror of Alba Longa. Ancus Marcius, the builder of the port of Ostia and the first bridge across the Tiber. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the Etruscan king who introduced engineering and cultural innovations. Servius Tullius, the reformer who divided citizens according to property status. Finally, Tarquinius Superbus, the cruel ruler whose tyranny led to the fall of the monarchy. Each of these kings, even if some of their deeds are fictional, symbolizes the stages of Rome's development, from myth to city, from chaos to order, from tribe to civilization. The reforms of Servius Tullius are especially important. He conducted a census and organized citizens into centuries, groups of 100, not based on kinship, but on wealth. This became the foundation for the future political and military structure of the Republic. Thus, even under the kings, Rome began to transform from a tribal association into an organized society with elements of class and property hierarchy. But with the rise of Tarquinius the Proud, the decline of royal power began. His reign was associated with tyranny, luxury, and contempt for the laws and the people. It was during his reign that the infamous episode with Lucretia occurred, a noblewoman who took her own life after being assaulted by the king's son. This tragic event sparked a wave of outrage that led to a revolution. In 509 BC, the Romans expelled Tarquinius and swore never again to allow one-man rule. Thus ended the era of kings and began the age of the Republic. The Republic, a common cause. This was not just a change in the form of government. It was a shift in mindset. Now, power had to be divided, limited, and held accountable. New institutions emerged: consuls, the Senate, and popular assemblies. They would continue to change and evolve. But the essence remained. Rome is not a king. Rome is its citizens. The transition to a republican form of government also marked the beginning of a more aggressive foreign policy. Freed from internal tyranny, the Romans began to look beyond their own borders. They needed space, resources, and security. Conflicts began with neighboring tribes, the Sabines, the Volsci, and the Equi. These weren't large-scale wars, but rather a series of small yet persistent skirmishes. However, each one gave Rome something new, military experience, and the strengthening of alliances. Over time, Rome began to realize that conquest was not just about the sword, but also about the word. Rome started making treaties, offering alliances, and introducing the practice of granting citizenship without voting rights to conquered but loyal territories. This was the beginning of the Roman system of integration. Complex, sometimes harsh, but effective. At the same time, the Roman army was taking shape, at first modeled after the Greek phalanx, but then, under the pressure of combat experience, becoming increasingly flexible, mobile, and focused on initiative and discipline. These principles would become the foundation of the military machine that would one day bring the entire Mediterranean world under its control. But the empire was still a long way off. For now, Rome was just a city and its surroundings. But even in this city, the spirit of greatness was already pulsing. Already on its streets, though dirty, simple, and lined with wooden houses, you could hear the footsteps of future legions. Already in its citizens, still poor and rough, there lived a sense of being chosen. The idea that Rome is not just a city, but a destiny. With the expulsion of the last king, Tarquinius the Proud, Rome entered a new era, the era of the Republic. This event was not just a change of rulers, it transformed the very essence of the Roman worldview. From now on, no one was supposed to hold absolute power. Power was supposed to belong to the people, or at least to those who considered themselves their representatives. At first, the Republic was an experiment. No one had ever tried to build such a balanced system of government before, where power was divided among several branches and decisions were made taking into account many factors: wealth, ancestry, and service to the state. At the head stood two consuls elected annually. They replaced the king, but did not possess his absolute power. Each could veto the decision of the other. This duality was intentional to prevent abuses of power. Behind the consuls stood the Senate, a council of elders, former magistrates, and representatives of noble families. Officially, the Senate was only an advisory body, but in reality, it was the one that shaped foreign policy, managed the treasury, and directed the actions of the consuls. The Senate became the true brain of the Republic, although it was patrician in nature. The popular assemblies, the comitia, allowed citizens to vote on laws and elect magistrates. However, each person's vote carried a different weight depending on their property qualification. The wealthy voted first, and their opinion was often decisive. This system worked as long as society remained relatively stable. But Rome was not homogeneous. Even in the early Republic, a serious social problem was beginning to brew: the struggle between patricians and plebeians. Patricians were the descendants of ancient families, landowners, priests, and officials. Plebeians were everyone else: farmers, artisans, merchants, and soldiers. They were free citizens, but they had no access to important positions, no right to marry patricians, and no guarantee of a fair trial. The plebeians did not revolt with weapons, but used a special form of protest called secession. They would simply leave the city, stop working, fighting, and paying taxes. This threatened the very existence of Rome, and the patricians were forced to make concessions. This is how the office of the tribune of the plebeians came to be. A magistracy that defended interests of common people. The tribunes held sacred status and the right of veto. They could stop any decision made by magistrate or senate if it harmed the plebeians. Later, the 12 Tables were adopted, the first written code of laws in Rome. These tables were displayed in the forum so that everyone could read them. This became a crucial step in the development of the rule of law. The conflict between the social classes did not die down for decades. The plebeians demanded access to the highest offices, to the consulship, and to the priesthood. And gradually, step by step, they achieved their goals. In 367 BC, the Licinian section law was passed, allowing one of the consuls to be a plebeian. In 287 BC, the Hortensian law made the decisions of the people's assemblies equal in force to those of the Senate. From then on, plebeian laws became binding for everyone. But at the same time, while Rome was fighting internal inequality, it was also actively waging wars. The first centuries of the Republic were spent in endless struggles with its neighbors, the Latins, Etruscans, Samnites, and Gauls. These wars were not just territorial conflicts. They shaped the Roman military system, strengthened alliances, and honed the practice of governing the conquered. A key episode was the Gallic catastrophe of 390 BC, when barbarians from the north broke into the city, plundered it, and left only after receiving a ransom. It was a shock. The Romans realized that for survival, they needed a standing army, strong walls, and most importantly, a spirit of resilience. The city was rebuilt quickly, and with renewed determination, they began to build an empire. During the Samnite Wars, Rome faced an enemy that forced them into tough battles in the mountains. The defeat at the Caudine Forks was especially humiliating when the Romans were forced to pass under the yoke of shame. But Rome knows how to learn from its defeats. They reformed their army, introduced more flexible tactical formations, maniples, and ultimately prevailed. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, Rome controlled almost all of Italy. But at the same time, Rome didn't just conquer. It created a network of alliances, built roads, and founded colonies. These measures didn't just solidify its power, they shaped Roman identity even beyond the city itself. In this way, the Roman Republic not only survived, it became a powerful machine capable of subjugating, integrating, and governing. Significant internal conflicts did not disappear, but now Rome had the most important things: political flexibility, military strength, and the belief that their city was not just one among many, but one chosen by destiny. The Roman Republic, having strengthened its internal institutions and expanded its control over Italy, entered a new phase of its development. This was a shift from a defensive policy to an offensive one, from a regional power to a future superpower. The foundation of this transformation was the army. Unlike during the royal period, the Roman army was now built not on clan obligations, but on a property-based census. Each category of citizen had its own place in the military system. Those who were poorer served in the light infantry or as part of allied contingents. The wealthy served in the heavy infantry, cavalry, and held command positions. Military service was considered both a duty and an honor. It opened the way to a political career and also strengthened the sense of belonging to the Republic. However, the army is not just about weapons, it is also about infrastructure. It was during the Republican period that large-scale road construction began via Appia, via Flaminia, and many others. These roads connected new territories, sped up the movement of legions, and stimulated trade. They became a kind of lifeline for the Republic. The political system also continued to grow more complex. In addition to consuls and tribunes, other magistracies appeared. Praetors were responsible for administering justice, Aediles oversaw city management, quaestors handled finances, and censors conducted the census and monitored public morals. All of them were elected, had limited terms, and were subject to a system of mutual checks and balances. Dictators played a special role, a unique magistracy introduced in times of extraordinary threat. The dictator was appointed by one of the consuls, approved by the Senate, and his authority lasted no more than 6 months. This was a temporary return to sole power, but it was strictly limited by the law. Cincinnatus became the symbol of the ideal dictator, a patrician who, after receiving dictatorial powers, defeated the enemy. He relinquished his powers and returned to plowing his field. Meanwhile, internal problems did not disappear. Despite the formal equalization of rights, social stratification in Rome was increasing. Wealthy families, the nobiles, emerged, concentrating power in their own hands. They formed a new aristocracy, not based on lineage, but on service and merit. To hold on to power, they resorted to patronage, clientelism, and the creation of dependent networks. Against this backdrop, a political struggle unfolded between two factions: the Optimates, conservative senatorial circles, and the popular politicians appealing to the people. For now, this struggle has not yet reached a critical point, but tensions are rising. The signs of future upheavals are already being felt. Meanwhile, Rome is becoming ever more deeply involved on the international stage. The Italian peninsula is becoming too small for its ambitions. The economy demands new markets, the army seeks new victories, and the people want new lands. All of this is pushing the Republic toward a confrontation with its main rival in the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. But before moving on to the great Carthaginian epic, it's worth noting a key feature of Roman expansion. It was always accompanied not just by conquest, but also by integration. The defeated peoples were not exterminated, but became allies. Some were granted partial citizenship, while others received full rights. Rome created a network of loyal communities that were required to provide soldiers and pay taxes, but in return, they received protection and a role in the great project, the building of Rome. This is how an empire was formed, even though it did not yet call itself an empire. Its strength lay not only in swords, but also in treaties, roads, and civil rights. This flexibility allowed Rome not just to conquer, but to hold onto territories, assimilate peoples, and turn enemies into allies. At the same time, a Roman identity began to take shape, the idea of a special mission and destiny. The Romans saw themselves as people chosen by fate to rule over other nations. Not for the sake of oppression, but for the sake of order, civilization, and law. This is exactly where the concept of Pax Romana comes from, the Roman world. But this confidence also had a downside, an intolerance for dissent. Rome hated kings and tyranny, so any deviation from republican principles was seen as a threat. Enemies of the Republic, whether internal reformers or foreign kings, faced fierce resistance. By the end of the 3rd century BC, Rome had become the undisputed leader of Italy. Its institutions had stabilized, its army had become more professional, its roads longer, and its ideology stronger. He was ready for the next step, and that step was monumental: the struggle against Carthage, a war for dominance in the Mediterranean, the birth of a global conflict that would forever change the fate of the Republic. It all began with an island. Sicily, a rich and strategically important land in the center of the Mediterranean, became the first real bone of contention between the two great powers of the ancient world. On one side, Rome, young, ambitious, and having just conquered almost all of Italy. On the other side, Carthage, a wealthy, influential maritime trading city founded by the Phoenicians, controlling vast colonies in North Africa, Spain, and the islands. Carthage ruled the seas, Rome ruled the land. For a while, their interests didn't overlap, but now they came face to face, and there could be no compromise between them. The First Punic War began, 264 to 241 BC. For Rome, this was a challenge. It had never fought at sea before. The Carthaginian fleet, on the other hand, was considered one of the strongest in the world. But the Romans, as always, surprised everyone. They built a fleet almost from scratch, using a captured Carthaginian ship as a model. And they didn't just build it, they invented a new device. The corvus, a boarding bridge with hooks that allowed them to seize enemy ships and turn naval battles into land combat. Rome made the sea an extension of its traditional tactics. The battle for Sicily turned out to be long and bloody. Victories were followed by defeats. Both sides lost fleet after fleet, but in the end, the Romans held out. They besieged and captured important Carthaginian strongholds, dealt a series of decisive defeats, and in 241 BC, Carthage sued for peace. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, followed by others, Sardinia and Corsica. This was the first step toward an empire. It was the first time Rome went beyond the borders of Italy and began to rule other peoples directly, not as an ally, but as a master. But Carthage did not accept defeat. Humiliation, loss of territory, and massive reparations. All of this sparked a thirst for revenge, and one man embodied it, Hamilcar Barca. Hamilcar, the hero of the First Punic War, withdrew with his army to Spain and began building a new power base there. With him was his young son, Hannibal. According to legend, as a child he swore before the altar that he would be Rome's eternal enemy, and he kept his word. When Hamilcar died, command first passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and then to Hannibal himself. And it was he who started the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, the greatest of all the wars Rome ever fought. Hannibal acted boldly and unexpectedly. Instead of attacking by sea, he led his army, along with war elephants, through the Pyrenees, the lands of the Gauls, and the Alps. It was a military feat unmatched in history. The losses were enormous, but he descended into Italy and began crushing Roman legions one after another. Trebia, Lake Trasimene, Kenny, 3 battles, 3 disasters for Rome. The defeat at Kenny, in particular, was a shock. The Romans lost up to 50,000 men in a single day. It was a nightmare come true. But Rome still did not break. They chose a new strategy: avoid direct battles, steer clear of confrontations, and wear the enemy down. This tactic was carried out by Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delayer. A meditative jury, Sigul irgur vu elbenaticos intervriae papinia. Such a contradictory approach for a military leader turned out to be salvation because he understood Hannibal was a genius, which meant you couldn't fight him by the rules. And yet, neither Fabius nor anyone else was able to drive Hannibal out. Only a new man, a young commander with a brilliant mind and strong will, dared to challenge him. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Africanus. Scipio proposed a bold plan. Instead of trying to drive Hannibal out of Italy, attack Carthage itself. He went to Spain, crushed the Carthaginian forces, then landed in Africa and forced the enemy to recall their army. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, two geniuses met face to face, and Scipio won. Carthage fell to its knees. It was stripped of its fleet, its territory, and its army. It remained as a city, but no longer posed a threat. And Rome? Rome had now become the master of the entire Western Mediterranean. After the victory at the Battle of Zama and the end of the Second Punic War, Rome found itself in a new, unprecedented position. It had not only survived, but had defeated an enemy that once seemed invincible. But along with this victory, a new era began, an era of growing influence, but also growing anxiety. Carthage, though defeated, did not disappear. It was still economically strong. It rebuilt its ports, trade, and agriculture. He paid taxes, didn't break contracts, but he existed. And for some Romans, that alone was enough to make them hate Carthage even more. Among them, one man stood out in particular, Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder, who is remembered by history not for his military achievements, but for his persistence. Every time he finished his speech in the Senate, he would add the same phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He repeated it like a mantra, and in the end, he was heard. In 149 BC, Rome found a pretext. The Carthaginians, defending themselves against their aggressive neighbors, the Numidians, who were allies of Rome, broke the terms of the peace treaty. The Senate declared war. The Third Punic War began. But this was no longer a struggle between two equal rivals. This was an execution. Rome demanded that Carthage destroy its walls, disarm, and move inland. The townspeople refused. They decided to die rather than surrender. The siege of Carthage lasted for 3 years. The city put up a desperate resistance. Women and children went up on the walls, houses were turned into fortresses, and the streets ran with blood. In 146 BC, Rome broke through. The city was destroyed to its foundations. The survivors were sold into slavery. The place where Carthage once stood was cursed. And so Rome's main enemy disappeared. But with it, the balance disappeared as well. Now Rome was the sole master of the Western world. Its provinces stretched from Spain to Illyria, from Gaul to Africa. Its army was everywhere. Its senators decided the fate of nations. But along with external power, cracks began to appear within. The Punic Wars changed everything. The army, which had once been made up of free peasants, was now increasingly filled with poor men who returned from war to devastated villages. Their land passed into the hands of the wealthy. Latifundia grew, while small farmers became poorer. A new type of citizen emerged, the proletarian, who had nothing except his offspring. These people flocked to Rome, looking for work, bread, and protection. Their numbers kept growing, and with that, so did their dependence on politicians willing to buy their loyalty. The Senate, which formally governed the state, understood the new realities less and less. Its members were far removed from the lives of ordinary people. They grew rich, built villas, and bought slaves by the thousands. The very idea of republican virtue began to fade. But the army became another problem. After Scipio's reforms and the subsequent campaigns, it became clear a soldier served not Rome, but his commander. Whoever paid was the one who earned their loyalty. Commanders began to raise personal armies, and this undermined the very foundation of the Republic, which was based on serving the common good. Meanwhile, Rome continued to expand. It entered into conflicts with Eastern powers, Macedonia, Syria, Pergamon, and once again emerged victorious. These victories brought gold, slaves, and new territories, but not peace. Each new victory fueled greed, bred corruption, and intensified social injustice. Ordinary citizens were increasingly asking, "Who are we fighting for?" and getting answers less and less often. At the same time, reformers' voices began to be heard in the Senate. But anyone who tried to change the system risked their life. After all, change threatened the interests of the most powerful families. Thus, the results of the Punic Wars turned out to be twofold. On one hand, Rome became great in terms of territory, military spirit, and political influence. On the other hand, it was these very wars that became a turning point. The Republic won the battle, but began to lose itself. There were still more wars and more victories ahead, but they no longer brought glory. They brought anxiety, bloodshed, and disintegration. And at the very heart of this collapse, names would emerge that would change the fate of Rome forever. The Gracchi, Marius, Sulla, Caesar. But there was still one more step and one more catastrophe before them. Rome defeated Carthage, subjugated Greece, and crushed the eastern kingdoms. It became the master of the Mediterranean, but the higher it rose, the more dangerous the abyss beneath it became. War enriched the elite but destroyed stability. Veterans returned to Rome empty-handed, while slave owners came back with caravans of slaves and gold. The Republic was coming apart at the seams. The first blows came from those who believed in the Roman ideal more than anyone else. The names of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus have forever remained in history as symbols of the beginning of the end. They came from a noble family, grandsons of the great Scipio, raised in the traditions of Roman duty and honor. But when they grew up, they saw a different side of the Republic: ruin, injustice, and poverty. Tiberius Gracchus, serving as a people's tribune in 133 BC, proposed an agrarian reform to limit land ownership for the wealthy and return land to impoverished citizens. This was not a revolutionary gesture, but a return to an old law that simply hadn't been enforced. But for the Senate, it was an attack on their privileges. Tiberius defied them. He tried to get re-elected for a second term, which was a violation of tradition. On the day of the vote, he and his supporters were hacked to death right in the Forum. This was the first time political violence became a tool of power in Rome. But the seed had already been planted. 10 years later, his brother Gaius Gracchus continued his work. He was sharper, more farsighted. He not only proposed land reform, but also reforms of the courts, grain distribution, and expanding the rights of the Italians. His enemies saw him as a dictator, and once again, violence. Gaius died, surrounded by soldiers, taking his own life so as not to fall into the hands of his enemies. The deaths of the Gracchus brothers became a signal. The Republic no longer resolves disputes by laws. Now the sword speaks. After this, an era of giants began. People whose power and ambition surpassed even the state institutions. The first of them was Gaius Marius. Marius was a new man, not descended from ancient noble families. He built his career thanks to his talent, but most importantly, he reformed the army. At his initiative, the army began to recruit not only wealthy citizens, but also proletarians, poor people who had neither land nor property. This changed everything. Now, soldiers served not the Republic, but whoever paid them. Their loyalty belonged to the general who could provide them with land and riches. Thus, the army became a personal instrument of power. Marius won many victories. He became a people's idol. He was called the third founder of Rome. But glory is no guarantee of stability. Soon, a rival appeared, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocrat just as talented, but far more ruthless. The first civil war began between them. The reason was a dispute over who would lead the troops against the Eastern king Mithridates. The Senate appointed Sulla, while the people chose Marius. Sulla refused to obey and, for the first time in history, led the legions into Rome itself. This set a precedent. The citizens of Rome saw that the army could be turned against them. The city was seized, opponents were executed, and the laws were rewritten. Later, when Marius returned to power and then died, Sulla became dictator. But not for 6 months, as was customary, but indefinitely. Sulla initiated proscriptions, lists of enemies who could be killed without trial. Their property was confiscated, and their heads were displayed in the forum. This was terror masked as legality. But unexpectedly, Sulla stepped down, relinquished his powers, and retired. He believed he had restored order to Rome, but in reality, he showed others that power could be seized by force. The main thing was to have legions behind you. After him, the Republic was never the same. Continued to exist in form, but its substance had changed. The Senate became an arena for struggle, the army a currency of influence, and the people a crowd that could be bought with bread and circuses. And in this new reality, another storm was brewing. A war veteran, one of Sulla's protégés, a man of incredible charm and strategic mind, Gaius Julius Caesar was already preparing to take the next step. Caesar started out as an ordinary politician. He was smart and charismatic, but so far he hadn't stood out in any way. His path to the top was gradual but determined. He knew that in the new Rome, the key to power was the army, popular support, and money. That's why he joined forces with the two most influential men of the time, Gnaeus Pompey and Marcus Crassus. This is how the first triumvirate came to be, an informal alliance of 3 men who divided power among themselves in the state. Caesar was given Gaul, a wild, untamed province where he would have to fight. And he didn't just fight, he created a legend. In just a few years, he subdued the tribes, built a bridge across the Rhine, and even invaded Britain. He sent reports back to Rome, his commentaries on the Gallic War. And he did this deliberately so that every citizen could see who was making Rome great. Meanwhile, Pompey stayed in Rome. Crassus went east and was killed at the Battle of Carrhae. The alliance fell apart. The Senate began to side with Pompey. Caesar was ordered to relinquish his command and return to Rome without his army. But Caesar knew it was a trap. He did what Sulla had done before. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon, a small river that separated the provinces from Italy. "The die is cast," he said. He marched not as a citizen, but as a conqueror. A civil war began between Caesar and Pompey. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar won a decisive victory. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was killed. Caesar arrived there and got involved in the dynastic disputes between the Ptolemies. He supported Cleopatra, the queen who became his ally and lover. After that, he returned to Rome not as a dictator in disguise, but as an absolute ruler. He became a dictator for life. He carried out reforms, simplified the laws, expanded the Senate, and distributed land to veterans. He was preparing Rome for a new form of government, but Rome is a city of traditions. The idea of a king, a monarch, was repulsive to the Romans. Many saw Caesar as a new king, and so they decided to kill him. On March 15th, 44 BC, the day he was supposed to leave the city to set out on a campaign against Parthia, he entered the Curia. There he was surrounded. He was struck by 23 knives. Among the conspirators was his friend Brutus. "You too, Brutus," Caesar supposedly said, and fell. The killers believed they were saving the Republic, but they were wrong. Caesar's death did not lead to the revival of the Republic, but to an even more brutal civil war. Three new figures stepped into the spotlight: Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir; Mark Antony, his ally; and Lepidus, a less prominent but influential politician. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate. They divided the empire, and they began to take revenge. Thousands of people were declared enemies of the state. Not only politicians were killed, but also philosophers, poets, and wealthy citizens. Seneca said, "If you were rich, you were dead." But even this alliance did not last long. Octavian and Antony soon became rivals. Antony grew close to Cleopatra, to Tala. He became king in the east. He sent letters to Rome in which he divided the Roman lands among her children. This became the reason for a new war. In 31 BC, a decisive naval battle took place at Cape Actium. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Agrippa, defeated the army of Antony and Cleopatra. They fled to Egypt. A year later, both of them took their own lives. Octavian was left alone and became the first emperor, Augustus. Formally, he restored the Republic. He refused the title of king. He called himself princeps, the first among equals. But in reality, he controlled everything: the army, finances, and politics. A new era began, the age of the empire. The Republic did not die in battle, but in silence. It became an empty shell, a form without substance. The people did not resist. After decades of war, terror, and poverty, people longed for only one thing: order. Augustus gave them order. He began to rule wisely, cautiously, and shrewdly. He established the Pax Romana, the Roman peace which would last for 100 years. He rebuilt the city, strengthened the borders, encouraged childbirth, and took care of grain, theaters, and circuses. But behind this facade, the most important thing was hidden. Rome was no longer a free state. It had become an empire ruled by a single will. And although many Romans understood this, no one dared to say it out loud. He was young, sickly, with a thin face and a tired look. When Julius Caesar was killed, Gaius Octavius didn't seem dangerous. The Senate wasn't afraid of him, and the people didn't know him. But it was he who became the man who not only survived the chaos, but also built a new system, the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar, who had no legitimate sons, adopted Octavius in his will. The young man, who was in Illyria at the time, quickly returned to Rome. He was only 18, but from the very beginning, he acted with cold determination. He was cautious, flexible, but firm. He didn't rush into battle like Mark Antony. He wove a web of alliances, agreements, and promises. At first, Octavian used Caesar's name. He became Caesar the Younger, demanded the will be carried out, including payments to the people. This secured him the support of the plebs. Then he formed an alliance with Antony and Lepidus to avenge Caesar's killers. This was how the Second Triumvirate came about. It was not a romantic alliance. It was a cold partnership. And it began with terror. Thousands of people ended up on death lists. Enemies were killed openly in the streets. Senators, equestrians, writers. Among the victims was, for example, the philosopher Cicero, whom Antony hated. Then came the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, where the armies of the triumvirate fought against the forces of Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's main assassins. The victory went to Octavian and Antony. The Republic was finally defeated. But even the alliance between these two strong personalities was starting to fall apart. Antony went east, where he immersed himself in the luxury and politics of Egypt. His alliance with Cleopatra became not just a romance, but also a challenge to Rome. He started acting like a Hellenistic king, handing out lands, honoring Egyptian cults, and forgetting about Italy. Octavian, on the other hand, stayed in Rome. He played the role of a republican. He strengthened ties with the Senate, built roads, restored temples, and organized festivals. He crafted the image of a defender of Roman values against the corrupt East. At the same time, he was running a propaganda campaign. His herald spread rumors about Cleopatra's debauchery and claimed that Antony had become her plaything. Octavian revealed Antony's will, in which he supposedly handed over Roman lands to Cleopatra's children. This caused shock and outrage. In 31 BC, the Romans gave Octavian a mandate to wage war against Egypt. The Battle of Actium became the climax. The fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was defeated. They fled. A year later, in Alexandria, both of them took their own lives. Octavian did not enter Egypt as a conqueror. He entered as the heir to the world. He spared many, established order, and annexed Egypt as his personal province. From then on, Egypt's riches went directly into Octavian's treasury. He was no longer dependent on the Senate, on taxes, or on the citizens. He had everything. In 27 BC, he returned to Rome. He could have declared himself king, but he chose a different path. He put on a show. He renounced power, returned control to the Senate, and in gratitude, they gave him the title Augustus, the exalted, the consecrated one. He was called Princeps, Parimm. He kept up a terrifying act. It was a grand deception, but a deception that everyone wanted. The Senate kept its pride. The people got peace and bread. The army got money and glory. Augustus established a new order. Republic of Restituta, the supposedly restored republic. But it was just a mask. All the power was in his hands. The armies, finances, provinces, courts, and priests. He became Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, uniting both political and spiritual authority in his own hands. He ruled skillfully. He didn't stage purges. He didn't humiliate the Senate. He built, he restored. He showed that it was possible to be a ruler without resorting to terror. His motto was simple: I found Rome built of brick, and I will leave it made of marble. And indeed, under his rule, Rome was transformed. New forums, theaters, aqueducts, and roads appeared. The city became the capital of the world, not just in name, but in grandeur as well. Augustus understood that for power to last, it had to be stable. He created an administrative system that could function without constant civil strife. He divided the empire into senatorial and imperial provinces, keeping the most important ones for himself, those where the legions were stationed. He reformed taxation, created a state grain reserve, and established pensions for veterans. Everything worked, and everything originated from him. He also took care of the moral character of society. Laws were passed against debauchery, family values were promoted, and marriage and childbirth were encouraged. Even literature became a tool of ideology. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, an epic that linked Augustus to Aeneas, the hero who fled Troy and became the ancestor of the Romans. In this way, Augustus's power gained a sacred, divine foundation. But not everything went smoothly. Rebellions broke out in the east, the war in Spain dragged on, and in the north, in Germany, a catastrophe occurred. In the year 9 AD, in the Teutoburg forest, 3 Roman legions under the command of Varus were ambushed. The Germanic tribes, led by Arminius, a former Roman ally who had switched sides, completely destroyed them. This was the first great wound to the empire. When Augustus heard about the defeat, he is said to have exclaimed, "Varus, give me back my legions." From that moment, expansion to the north was halted. Rome consolidated its position along the Rhine and Danube rivers. The borders stabilized. As Augustus grew older, he thought more and more about his legacy. He wanted power to be transferred peacefully. But Rome had no mechanism for succession. His potential heirs died one after another: Marcellus, Agrippa, Lucius, Gaius. In the end, he chose Tiberius, the son of his wife Livia from her first marriage. In the year 14 AD, Augustus died in Nola. He was 75 years old. He had ruled for more than 40 years. He was buried with honors and elevated to the rank of a god. Rome was saying goodbye to the man who had turned chaos into order. But behind the facade of stability, tension was building. Tiberius, the new emperor, was withdrawn, suspicious, and distant from the people. He strengthened the power of the Praetorian Guard. Informing and political trials began. The Senate once again became a compliant tool. After him came Caligula. At first, he was the people's favorite, then a madman who declared himself a god and appointed his horse as consul. He was killed. Then came Claudius, a middle-aged, stuttering historian whom the Praetorians literally pulled out from behind a curtain. He turned out to be an effective administrator. He conquered Britain and improved the courts. But his wife killed him so that her son could ascend to the throne. Nero. It was with him that a new chapter began, not only in the history of the empire, but also in the concept of power. At first, Nero ruled fairly well with the help of wise advisors, but then he became absorbed in the arts, suspicion, and luxury. He carried out executions and persecutions. His mother died, as did senators and poets. Rome burned, and according to legend, he played the lyre as it happened. The Christians were declared guilty. The first persecutions began. In the year 68 AD, Nero took his own life. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The following year, 4 emperors succeeded each other on the throne. This was the first succession crisis, the first sign that even Augustus's great system could be fragile. The year 69 AD, the Roman Empire found itself at the epicenter of turmoil. After Nero's death, the throne became a plaything in the hands of the legions. One after another, rebellions broke out and new emperors were proclaimed: Galba, Otho, Vitellius. None of them held onto power. The legionaries cast their votes with their swords. Cities burned. Power became a prize people were willing to die for. This was the year of the 4 emperors. At the end of this storm, Vespasian emerged victorious, a veteran who had commanded troops in Judea. He was not an aristocrat, not a descendant of Caesar, but a new man, a man of action. With him, a new dynasty began, the Flavians. He understood that the empire needed order. Not outward luxury, but a solid foundation. He curbed the excesses of the Praetorians, restored the finances, and reformed the army. He began building what would become the symbol of Rome, the Colosseum, an amphitheater that could hold tens of thousands of spectators, a place where the empire displayed its power, generosity, and cruelty. After him, Titus and Domitian ruled. The first was valiant, but not for long. He ended the Jewish war and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. But in Rome, he was remembered for his mercy. The second, Domitian, became a tyrant. He ruled with an iron fist, inspired fear, but also achieved stability. He was killed in the palace. The Senate breathed a sigh of relief. The people did not, and then the Golden Age began. 5 emperors, who would later be called the Good Ones: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. They had one thing in common: none of them were related to their predecessors. Each of them adopted his successor, choosing someone worthy rather than a blood relative. It was an era of wise rulers, philosophers, and reformers. Nerva, an elderly senator, came to power in 96 and established the main principle: the emperor is not a king, but a servant of the state. He adopted a talented general and did not make a mistake. Trajan became the embodiment of Roman virtue. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He conquered Dacia, subdued the Arab territories, and reached the Persian Gulf. He was called Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. Under him, Rome became not just great, but truly global. But Trajan understood that everything conquered had to be held. His successor, Hadrian, thought differently. He wasn't a conqueror, he was a builder. He gave up distant eastern conquests and strengthened the borders. He built Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a symbol of the empire's limits. He traveled through the provinces, spoke with the people, leveled roads, and restored aqueducts. He saw Rome as a single organism, not just as a capital. Antoninus Pius continued this approach. His reign was the most peaceful in the history of the empire. No wars, no coups, no uprisings. Only stability, prosperity, and well-ordered laws. He was a model of moderation and respect for tradition. And then came Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher on the throne, author of Meditations, a man of duty, resilience, and profound thought. His fate, however, was a difficult one. He ruled during times of plague, rebellions, and invasions. Germanic tribes attacked the borders once again, but he did not give up. He went to the legions, lived in tents, and led the army into battle. He was the last of the greats and perhaps the very best. His reign was the pinnacle of Rome, spiritually, politically, and culturally. When he died in the year 180, Marcus Aurelius broke with tradition. Instead of adopting a worthy successor, as his predecessors had done, he handed power over to his own son, Commodus. This decision proved to be fatal. Commodus possessed neither his father's wisdom nor his sense of duty. He loved the circuses, fame, and luxury. He called himself Hercules, appeared in the amphitheater as a gladiator, and even renamed Rome as the colony of Commodus. The empire laughed and wept. His reign marked the beginning of the end. Commodus was killed. He was followed by a series of short-lived emperors, uprisings, and intrigues. But despite all this, the structure of Rome still held together. The army was strong, the economy stable, the cities well-developed, and the provinces loyal. Why? Because after 2 centuries of peace, Rome had become deeply rooted in the world. Its roads connected thousands of settlements. Its laws became part of everyday life. Its architecture became synonymous with civilization. In Gaul, Spain, North Africa, and Asia Minor, everywhere there were forums, theaters, and baths. People wore togas, spoke Latin, and prayed to Roman gods. The empire was a global project, not just political but also cultural. In return, it provided roads, courts, protection, and entertainment. Even conquered peoples gradually became Romans. The central element of this process was civic integration. As early as the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, Roman citizenship began to be granted on a large scale. And in the year 212, Emperor Caracalla proclaimed the Antonine Constitution and granted citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. This was a turning point. Rome became not just a city, not just Italy. It became an idea, a project for all of humanity. By this time, Rome's architectural legacy was astonishing. Temples like the Pantheon with its unmatched dome, aqueducts that supplied cities with clean water, arenas that could hold tens of thousands of spectators, forums where politics took place. All of this was not just a product of power. But also of engineering genius. Check, Kjofre, Regashon fight, Kjofre, Regashon fight. Technologies like concrete made it possible to build quickly and reliably. The Romans invented arches, vaults, and domes, and used them to create wonders. Everything was calculated, organized, and standardized. They wrote codes of law, created an administrative bureaucracy, assigned titles, monitored taxes, and conducted censuses. The empire was a mechanism complex but well-tuned, could be governed from a distance. It was built not only on swords, but also on forms, tables, and orders. However, tension was growing behind all of this. While the center flourished, instability was increasing on the borders. The Germanic tribes were uniting. In the east, a new power was rising, Sassanid Persia. Moreover, social polarization was taking place within the empire. The rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. More and more people depended on state handouts, free bread and entertainment, while fewer relied on their own labor. The army was changing as well. It was increasingly being filled with barbarians. The old idea of the citizen soldier was fading away. In its place came professionals, often foreigners. The legion was becoming more of a class weapon than an instrument of the Republic. Nevertheless, the Pax Romana was an era of golden balance. Despite the first cracks appearing, Rome remained unbreakable. It was a symbol of order, law, and greatness. Its ideals, such as its legal system, civil administration, and infrastructure, would live on for centuries. But all great things are temporary, even the eternal city. And the next century would show that holding onto an empire is harder than building one. The 3rd century AD, Rome is still great. It still rules a vast territory from the British Isles to Syria, from the Danube to the Sahara. But something has changed. This greatness no longer seems stable. Behind the glittering facade, you can sense fatigue, tension, and decay. This isn't a sudden collapse. It's a slow but relentless weakening. It all began with a deep crisis of power. Emperors are replaced one after another. Between the years 235 and 280, in just 50 years, more than 20 emperors sat on the throne. Almost all of them met a violent death. The legions proclaim their own commanders as emperors and fight among themselves. The army no longer protects the empire. It decides who will rule it. This period would come to be known as the crisis of the 3rd century. But the problem wasn't just the ambitions of the generals. Rome had forgotten how to govern its own world. The population suffered from endless taxes, inflation, and epidemics. Money lost its value. Silver denarii contained less and less silver. Trade declined, cities decayed, and the provinces grew poorer. The empire was coming apart at the seams. At the same time, external threats were becoming more and more acute. In the east, the Sassanid state was growing stronger, aggressive, centralized, and wealthy. It challenges Rome in Mesopotamia and Syria. In the year 260, the Persian king Shapur I captured the Roman Emperor Valerian himself, a humiliation without precedent. In the north and west, barbarian peoples were growing stronger. The Goths, the Franks, the Alemanni, and the Vandals. They no longer just raid. They penetrate deeper, burn cities, stay for the winter, and demand land. They are not afraid of Rome because Rome has grown weak. In the year 251, the Goths killed Emperor Decius in battle. In 260, the Franks reached as far as Spain. For the first time since the 3rd century BC, enemies feel free on Roman soil. But it's not just the barbarians destroying the borders. The empire is collapsing from within. The old Roman values, pietas, virtus, gravitas, no longer live in people's hearts. The youth don't study history, they gamble instead. The Senate is an empty formality. Imperial power is a private matter for the Praetorians. The soldiers don't fight for an ideal, but for their pay. Rome is losing its soul. And yet, even in this dark hour, there are figures who try to hold the world together. One of them is Aurelian, emperor from the 270s to 275. He managed to drive back the barbarians, suppress uprisings, and restore the borders. He built a new wall around Rome to protect the capital from new raids. He was strict but effective. He was called Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. But he too was killed. It's as if the empire refuses to learn from its mistakes. By the year 284, it becomes clear the old order no longer works. And then, a man appears who decides to change everything. His name is Diocletian. Diocletian came to power in 284 and quickly realized, to save the empire, it wasn't about restoring the old ways, but about rebuilding everything from scratch. He started with the most important thing, governance. The empire had become too big, too diverse, and too vulnerable for one person to manage it effectively. The solution was the tetrarchy, rule by 4. Diocletian divided the empire into east and west, appointing an Augustus, senior emperor, and a Caesar, junior successor, to each part. He took the east for himself, appointed Maximian as Augustus of the west, and gave each of them an assistant. This was a system with a strict hierarchy, regular rotation of power, and a clear administrative chain of command. He also carried out large-scale reforms, monetary, tax, and military. He created a fixed tax system and introduced in-kind obligations, especially in agriculture. He strengthened the borders, increased the size of the army, and created separate mobile units, comitatances, to deal with sudden invasions. But he also had another side, a darker one. Diocletian became the initiator of the last and largest persecution of Christians. He saw them as a threat to the unity of the empire, a challenge to the traditional Roman order. Temples were destroyed, priests were arrested, and Christians were subjected to torture and executions. Rome once again reminded everyone, it does not tolerate those who put God above the emperor. However, something had changed. Previously, Christians were a small movement, but now their numbers reached into the millions. They were everywhere, in cities, villages, and even in the army. It was impossible to eradicate them. Diocletian left the throne voluntarily, the first in history to do so. He retired to his palace in Split, which is now in modern-day Croatia. He grew cabbages and watched as the system he had created fell apart. His successors began to fight for power, and in this struggle, a new leader emerged, Constantine. He was the son of one of the Caesars, a commander of legions, a politician, and a strategist. But he became something more. In the year 312, before the decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge, he reportedly saw a cross in the sky with the inscription, "In hoc signo vinces." He ordered this symbol to be placed on his warriors' shields. He entered Rome, and soon issued the Edict of Milan, the Riches, granting religious tolerance to Christians. The empire, which had recently persecuted the followers of Christ, now accepts them as equals. But Constantine went even further. He realized that old Rome was a symbol of paganism, corruption, and exhaustion. He founded a new capital on the site of ancient Byzantium on the shores of the Bosphorus. He named it Constantinople, the New Rome. This city would become the new heart of the empire, more defensible, closer to the wealthy eastern provinces, protected by both land and sea. Meanwhile, Christianity was becoming not just a faith, but the foundation of a new ideology. At the end of the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius I would make it the state religion. Pagan temples would be closed. Sacrificial offerings were banned. The empire, which had once worshipped Jupiter and Mars, now prayed to Christ. The change of faith, the relocation of the capital, and the administrative reform, these were the rebirth of Rome, but not its salvation. Symbolically, it still held together, but inside there was exhaustion. The people themselves had changed. Citizens no longer fought. Mercenaries fought for them. The provinces were overburdened with taxes, and officials were corrupt. Political will was weak. There were no more Marcus Aureliuses or Trajans, only compromises remained. Meanwhile, a storm was brewing on the northern borders. Barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, felt the pressure of new nomadic peoples coming from the depths of Asia. Ahead of them were the Huns. These swift, elusive warriors on small horses moved westward, pushing everything out of their way. The barbarians sought refuge and turned their eyes toward the empire. They no longer wanted to destroy. They wanted to live inside Rome. But Rome was not ready to accept them, or to accept them properly. And this clash of worlds would mark the beginning of the end for the western part of the empire. By 395 AD, what had long been brewing within the empire became official, the division into eastern and western parts. Emperor Theodosius I died, leaving behind 2 sons, Arcadius and Honorius. One received the east with its new capital in Constantinople, while the other got the west, centered in Ravenna. From that moment on, the empire became a two-headed entity, with one part strong, wealthy, and well-defended, and the other vulnerable and weakened. Western Rome suffered from tremendous pressure. The economy was devastated, harvests were poor, and the cities became deserted. Provinces, one after another, broke away from imperial control. The army, filled with barbarians, often obeyed their generals more than the emperors. And then came the year 410 AD. What once seemed unthinkable became reality. Rome fell. The city that for centuries was considered invincible was captured and plundered by the Goths under the leadership of Alaric. The residents woke up to the sounds of battle cries, the clash of swords, and screams. Sacred temples were desecrated, palaces were ruined. Fear gripped the empire. This was not the end, but a psychological turning point. The world was no longer certain of Rome's immortality. The Church tried to explain what was happening. St. Augustine wrote about the city of God, asserting that earthly Rome may fall, but there is another, spiritual and eternal. Meanwhile, wave after wave of barbarian peoples swept across Europe. The Vandals, after crossing the Mediterranean Sea, invaded Africa and captured Carthage. They turned the former Roman breadbasket into their own kingdom and established a fleet that terrorized the coast of Italy. In the year 455, they entered Rome again and looted it once more. This blow was even more painful than the previous one. In the east, the empire held on more firmly. Constantinople was protected by the massive Theodosian walls, which held back any threat. The eastern part had a strong economy, administrative clarity, and centralized power. Byzantine Rome was adaptable. He knew how to change. The West, on the other hand, was rotting from within. Western emperors became puppets, often children installed by barbarian generals. One such commander was Ricimer, a Germanic leader who controlled the empire from the shadows. He couldn't be emperor because of his origins, but he appointed and deposed them at will. By the middle of the 5th century, it became clear the West was no longer governed from Rome. It was losing its meaning as a state. The provinces were falling under the control of the barbarians. In Britain, Roman garrisons had left, abandoning the local population to their fate. In Gaul, new kingdoms of the Franks and Burgundians were forming. In Spain, the Suebi and the Visigoths. Rome no longer fights for the empire. It tries to survive among the ruins, to negotiate, to buy its way out. But its strength is fading, while its enemies only grow stronger. The last decades of the Western Roman Empire were less a struggle for survival and more a slow decline. Emperors were replaced at a staggering pace, sometimes not even living long enough to be crowned. The real power no longer belonged to them, but to barbarian warlords who officially served Rome, yet had long been playing by their own rules. One such man was Odoacer, a commander of Germanic origin who led the foederati in the Roman army. In the year 476, he rose up against the latest emperor Romulus Augustulus, a young boy who became the last symbol of Roman authority. Odoacer deposed him and did not proclaim himself emperor. He simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople as a gesture acknowledging that the empire had come to an end. That year, 476, is considered the official date of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But there was no thunder, no final battle. Everything happened quietly, almost symbolically. The empire did not die with a scream, but rather let out its final breath. And that is the essence of its fall. Not from a single blow, not from a single enemy, but from hundreds of wounds, economic, political, moral, from the loss of the spirit that once made a Roman unique. But the East lived on. The empire continued to exist in Constantinople under a new name, in new attire. Byzantium, the direct heir of Rome, would last for almost another 1,000 years. Its emperors would call themselves Basileus of Rome. His people would speak Greek, but still consider themselves Romans. And what happened to the West? There, on the ruins of the empire, a new history began. The barbarians didn't destroy everything. They adopted much. Roman culture, Roman law, the language, the religion, all of this survived the fall. The barbarians were baptized, wore togas, spoke Latin, and used Roman terms. Rome fell as a state, but not as a civilization. It dispersed, it dissolved, but it did not disappear. Its legacy can be seen in the Catholic Church, in the Latin alphabet, in architecture, in laws. Europe did not become anti-Rome. It became a new Rome in different forms, but with the same foundation. The idea of an empire, unified, eternal, just would live on for centuries. The Franks would call their state the Holy Roman Empire. Russian princes would speak of Moscow as the Third Rome. Every subsequent century would look back in search of greatness, order, a model to follow. Because Rome is not just a city, not just an army, not just its rulers. Rome is a symbol, an eternal reference point, the image of the ideal state that humanity will strive for again and again. Rome fell, but Rome did not disappear. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of history. An empire that lost its power and territory continued to live on in people's minds, in their habits, in their words. As the centuries passed, it became less of a memory and more of a standard, an ideal, a legend that kings, popes, and revolutionaries aspired to. So what exactly was Rome's legacy? What made it so influential that even 1,500 years after the fall of the Western Empire, we can still feel its presence?
on get no one up. Them are fair with show. They do your lady back will be. First luck for the work and make it more. Thank you were in that in the ship merit thought beast to get you her aim was at more was nursed or facade of your vet. Her little rear vet. And the sharing as you in your vet. Our very below I yes it doing it. Her no sit with us like will it's name near a property was dead. The shake if in net and the scarce Greg was thought of. This guy's name and it's such dance it so that Roachne so at virus did up serious skull and looks and stabs do a rush gastic all road that there are some more sharp percent and she is Elvis for the ice Sigel and drop with some more spattered up. Sister strofe and strofe for spasted or set verse smashing him over net. See me early getting him off for floor on the make it in the steel. Mary Street first and it's a serious dilemma. Snow fnits and the shoeless nearing the nets in it. And the shares in the gross state and the opposite state and Missouri still in some more room of it. And the fact I was thought up. And the fact I was being more on the hours. Snare roads in April your floor on the make it store for it. And if it was in the cell net, see the line, sir. Snare that with mistress. Here's saying all this help for it. Scav broke the position did it. Say no, Estos, he will. Said the fact. Shit, more than as it for guy or sit. Seriousness from the night, not shake then I for you better off make it. They have zero lodger of burst or dills in it. See if skill buffer spasted or make it 30 if man is 30. It's not center with a search Sam with the opposite. He have no wish of caps or net. Class beast is nesta. Muzzle was the Hirsch flux it. Drawn on a week drums that fell more. And the amber. Slice med sleet master fortunation in murder on it. Sever skill buff get that and set with lucky pretty able to over and a shade knife at the mouth. He's by old seed up, stir, sitter of sent series, start the fire. He was said eight, and the citizen more rubber so you live. More receipt carrot ever it. More receipt or skastic got it. More did off get. Here's nest nicht in the shoes, it's not going to get fire groups or that from you knife and the crime being there. So last no ever says up sucks and you beat her also said the law. All the lures are wife and share pests is no liveness cashed from its sister. I'll look at a little neighbor, but no, it's no can make it. So can the market a kill buffalo schneider several kill buffer with what eyes the eye. Letting a show with neural from her skill buffer net sees her combat or street throw from the shade knife and make it full arms. The nefness, the hours who win. Here I still am in this verse. Snish calling it off, question as it is. Here we spin it or not, and it up, or the ask out spatting it on to it. More in our hopes, so can the market but the for the full of snobs or feel look at it looking at the sister beset up. Cash busted such nonsense as it is a bit best knock it. She is a little bit in herself, but there is syrup in our ville, and she is in the girl shows it. The hate suspicion is this type of say the animal real but so and selling it or beating the beat. Stung elnet, her skastic up. Oh, Lurthy more than not as well as the girls more up. More girth it's a white sam then milk. More was her it's was my lock snake gives her us in the shower of it her elnet. Here the 50 strophulous net says goes doing this nicht more. My snares of it. Here schnes nicht the under listening it's sal. Nee, is niet meer een schijn immersed in de ja, met een more real glass is it. Er is nou stemmer van de sheriff sneaking ours gapped up. Heel er heel ding heeft ach gapped aan. More valve rust aus gaan aan movie him. Er ook serven uit nimmer is de lezet er ja, met het best nacht. Er was tot aan met more way die uit zorg van nee. More Nishnev and Nishdiller in the stools is that. Some scam scaffes not. Walk with the Lord out in the V. She has illushness. Spaceship. See out. Much as fierce and him more with the bad Dashurshnish circuit. Whatever and make you be Lushnevets and the circuit you circle surf to where I have made that's it here, safe or out. Nishdiller not snow from its numbers that I have saw more. Yeah, no more run it. Get the right neural surf salve them yelling it with get silence more steel and for your street flaw. The sharps give a either elknet, send with the officer, and the shit never got in his legs beloved. Slopes no more than it off to get it out. And else was it was named fish, blacker scarps. Orkish dalne, get I'm it's surreal. And you can get 3 hours the stir web at such non zero in L. Smurfing L0 is the lie up, sir. Got the this nivy. Stamel bit net, sir. Relax. Will be the rich that was doing L of name or the zero snessor. Doing L der guest in L dem stirred. The stiller nets now saw was leaf and the eel ships shilling its new fnick was sorted. My name or net, see stroke, schnapes, snurf, and the elastic. Stöng alls wat burgerjachten en of een scheer knife get zoeken en mee hidden el. Stöng alls get sater dan. Fast in I lore would sound a gropty. Knock such and did more. Well off noose, got look at it. Now when the stealer barrow. The schneven in more rosets and marrow. Slap, stews, the alp was her all fjell when she is in a grok at I'm at sisters that her scarf surfing bit best knock. Smash almost by a wood laughing and out in the burn each bird snow fnick see this no more by a neck. Yeah, this door where these slits in the green net, and I had slits to steer bread. Such the either flips no more with the line of schmuffer at the was sort of the ass or at the wheel more answers the militia. Such the store scout of cat and knife that my select. What's what I eat in her sting it over slow stuff, snemmel letting it look such an roxy the law. Here, not. Smart slav zich drop. Arranging in that or got the drops it in the street was not global rips in it and it gets some more. So mouth and that will serve a new year up so up with nerf seed. Says it slice me then that's the aroma of snash nick no one. Says it slice me then that's the aroma of snash nick no one. It's back keep some snimmy ruka. I never not sit guy. Serge no more nishni is gaps here that's his ear for like need. All of us not up sketch surfers and the button do sal on yeah, this nivy. She have dropped in the V net, Graham and Al, very the lot, some of us and Mr. Sluggy would but see up in the emerald. All of us when she had knife and make it do exit. Here's nests gissen in a unit, sister matter, not by direction she had for that. Silver series is broken, that was in a shin of federal fees to receive the law. He does not look ill net, either live out, sinister in it, either power. Nacht, dus dat is best nacht. Hier zeggen is gewoon meer vluggiel gedaan met z'n snijf. Dit zo met mijn over de deur, maar een sneeuw was surged. Al niet meer zo maar op het surf.